Welcome to our deep dive into the idea of friendship with God.
Ooh.
We've got two sources for you today,
Right.
a personal story from the Apostolic Faith Church's daily devotional, and a theological exploration from a Grand Canyon University blog post.
Interesting.
What's interesting is how these sources approach the same concept from such different angles.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how personal experience and academic theology can actually intertwine when we talk about something as profound as friendship with God.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with that personal story from the devotional.
Right.
It's about a woman who ends up missing a concert with her family
Okay.
due to unforeseen circumstances, leaving her feeling pretty lonely.
Right. And in that moment of loneliness, she prays to God,
Yeah.
specifically asking for his friendship.
Wow.
What's striking is what happens next.
Right. Her brother-in-law unexpectedly shows up with her favorite latte.
Yeah.
And she interprets this as a direct answer to her prayer, a tangible sign of God's friendship. Later on, though, her brother-in-law doesn't even remember bringing her the latte.
This raises a thought-provoking question about how we perceive God's actions in our lives.
Huh.
Is it possible that we sometimes see divine intervention in events that might have perfectly ordinary explanations?
It makes you wonder how much our own desires and expectations influence how we interpret certain events,
Right.
especially when it comes to something as personal as your relationship with God.
Exactly.
The story also touches on the biblical verse, "A friend that sticketh closer than a brother,"
Yeah.
emphasizing God's closeness.
But the GCU blog post takes a slightly different approach.
Okay.
Yes, the blog post dives into the theological framework of friendship with God.
Okay.
And it starts by stating that this isn't a friendship between equals.
Hmm.
It's not like two buddies hanging out.
Right.
There's a fundamental difference in nature between us and God.
So it's a different kind of friendship with its own unique set of dynamics.
Exactly. And the blog post goes on to explain that the foundation of this friendship lies in reconciliation.
Okay.
It argues that sin has created a separation between humanity and God, and that needs to be addressed before true friendship can exist.
Reconciliation. It's like when you have a falling out with a friend and you need to talk things through, apologize, and rebuild that trust before things can go back to normal.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And in the context of our relationship with God, the blog post explains that reconciliation is made possible through Jesus,
Okay.
whose death bridges that gap caused by sin.
So we can't just jump into this friendship without acknowledging the need for reconciliation. There's a process involved.
That's the core idea the blog post is getting at. Reconciliation is the essential first step.
Right.
And once that's happened, the GCU post lists several benefits of friendship with God.
Okay.
Things like his care provision, guidance, comfort, and ultimately reception into his presence.
Wow.
It echoes some of those ideas of closeness we saw in the devotional story.
Right, like that feeling of being cared for when the woman received the latte. But I'm guessing friendship with God isn't just about receiving benefits. What about our responsibilities in this relationship?
You're absolutely right. The blog post is very clear that this friendship is a two-way street.
Okay.
While God offers us these incredible benefits,
Yeah.
there are also responsibilities on our part.
Makes sense.
The post emphasizes things like loyalty, allegiance, and obedience to God as key components of maintaining this friendship.
So it's about actively demonstrating our commitment to God,
Yeah.
showing him that we value the relationship just as much as he values it.
Exactly.
And if we think back to that woman in the devotional,
Right.
her act of prayer could be seen as her seeking God's friendship, which then led to that experience with the latte. It's fascinating how both sources are pointing towards this reciprocal aspect of the relationship.
Absolutely. Even though the sources come from different perspectives, one deeply personal and the other more academic, they both converge on this idea that friendship with God involves both giving and receiving, that it's something we actively participate in rather than just passively observe.
This is already making me rethink my own understanding of what it means to have a relationship with God.
I can imagine.
But before we go any further, I want to bring up some of the biblical examples mentioned in the GCU blog post.
Great idea.
These examples provide a historical and scriptural context for this concept of friendship with God.
Absolutely.
The blog post mentions three key figures: Abraham, Moses, and the disciples of Jesus.
Yeah.
Each one highlights different facets of what this unique relationship can look like. Okay, let's start with Abraham. The blog post points out that he's actually called God's friend in Isaiah 41:8.
Right.
What's so special about Abraham that earned him that title?
Well, what's significant about Abraham is that he's considered the father of faith in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Okay.
He's portrayed as someone who deeply trusted God, even when faced with seemingly impossible situations. And it's this unwavering trust, this willingness to follow God's guidance, even without fully understanding the reasons why.
Uh-huh.
That's seen as a key element of his friendship with God.
So it's not just about believing in God, but about actively living out that belief, even when it's challenging or it doesn't make sense from a human perspective.
Exactly. It's about aligning your actions with your faith, even when it requires a leap of faith.
Right.
And that's precisely what we see in Abraham's story.
Okay.
His willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac at God's command is perhaps the most powerful example of this unwavering trust.
That story always felt so intense to me. The idea of being asked to make such a sacrifice, it's difficult to even comprehend.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It speaks to the depth of Abraham's faith and his willingness to surrender even the most precious things to God.
Yeah.
And it's through these tests of faith that his friendship with God is refined and strengthened.
But beyond Abraham, we also have Moses,
Yeah.
who's described in Exodus 33:11 as speaking to God face to face as a man speaks to his friend. This imagery paints a vivid picture of intimacy and open communication qualities that are essential to any genuine friendship.
Absolutely.
Wow, face to face. That suggests a level of closeness and trust that's hard to even fathom.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something we can aspire to in our own relationship with God?
It's a great question, and one that we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll delve into what those kinds of conversations with God might look like for us today,
Yeah.
and how we can cultivate that intimacy and openness in our own spiritual lives.
This is already getting me so excited to dive deeper. But for now, let's pause here, having explored these initial concepts from our sources.
Okay.
Join us for part 2, where we'll continue this exploration of what it means to be friends with God.